It was a quiet evening in a suburban neighborhood. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the last traces of daylight were fading. The streets were empty except for the occasional car parked along the curb, their headlights slowly dimming as the night crept in. Amelia Roberts, a 35-year-old black woman, walked briskly down the sidewalk, the soft tap of her shoes on the pavement the only sound in the cool air. After a long day of high-stakes work at the CIA, all she wanted was to get home, relax with a cup of tea, and escape the weight of her responsibilities. Amelia was used to long hours and the kind of pressure that came with her line of work. But tonight, she felt unusually uneasy. There was something about the stillness in the air that made her skin crawl, like something was about to break the silence. Her black coat hung loosely over her movements steady but deliberate as she made her way down the street. Despite the calm appearance, she carried herself with a quiet sense of readiness. Beneath her coat, tucked securely in the inside pocket, was her CIA ID, and on her hip, just within reach, was her Glock 19, a tool she was trained to use if the situation ever called for it. Across the street, a police car slowly rolled into view, its headlights cutting through the dim light. Officer John Hayes, a 42-year-old veteran of the force, was driving through the neighborhood, doing his routine patrol. He noticed Amelia right away. She was walking alone late at night in a predominantly white neighborhood. Something about the scene caught his attention, and his instincts flared. As a seasoned cop, he'd learned to trust those instincts, even if they weren't always rational. He pulled his patrol car to the side of the street, the tires skidding slightly on the asphalt. The sudden movement startled Amelia, and she stopped, looking toward the vehicle. Hayes rolled down his window, his eyes scanning her as he spoke, voice firm. "Ma'am, I need to speak with you for a moment." Amelia's eyebrows furrowed, her posture immediately straightening. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice was calm but steady, the faintest hint of suspicion in her tone. Hayes stepped out of the car, his body language rigid, his hand hovering near his gun. "What are you doing here at this hour?" he asked, eyeing her suspiciously. Amelia paused. "I'm just walking home," she said, her voice unwavering. "Is that a problem?" His jaw tightened. Hayes wasn't convinced. "We've had reports of suspicious activity. You don't seem familiar around here. Just trying to make sure everything checks out." Amelia stood her ground, though a slight frustration flickered in her chest. "I'm not doing anything illegal. I'm just walking home." Hayes didn't seem to hear her. His eyes narrowed as he took a step closer, his tone growing more demanding. "I'm going to need to see some ID. Just a formality." Amelia blinked in surprise, then shook her head slightly. "I don't need to show you my ID unless I've done something wrong, officer." The officer's patience was wearing thin. His voice grew sharper, tinged with authority. "You need to cooperate. It won't be difficult. Just show me your ID, and we can all move on." Amelia's heart rate quickened, but she stayed composed. She had dealt with encounters like this before. Police officers who assumed the worst based solely on her appearance. "I haven't done anything wrong," she repeated, her voice firm. Hayes stepped forward, almost closing the distance between them. "You can't just walk around like this at this hour. If you don't comply, I'm going to escalate this. Do you want to make this harder on yourself?" Amelia's pulse raced, but she refused to back down. This wasn't just about her. It was about standing her ground in the face of authority that assumed she was guilty without cause. "I know my rights, officer. I'm not required to show you my ID if I'm not breaking any laws." Hayes' expression hardened. "If you don't show me your ID, you'll regret it." Amelia took a deep breath, her fingers brushing the edge of her coat where her weapon was holstered. She knew it wasn't the time to make any sudden moves. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," she said, her voice steady but edged with frustration. Amelia stood still, trying to keep her breathing steady as the officer's presence weighed on her. Hayes' eyes were intense, scanning her like a threat, while the flashing lights of the police car painted eerie patterns on the pavement. She could feel the tension growing, thickening the air around them. "I've already told you," Amelia said, her voice firm but controlled. "I'm just walking home. I'm not doing anything wrong." Hayes didn't move, his eyes still fixed on her, suspicious and unyielding. "You're really going to make this harder than it needs to be, huh? I'm asking you to cooperate. If you've got nothing to hide, why resist?" Amelia didn't flinch. though her pulse quickened. She had dealt with this before. The judgment. The assumption that because she was black, she was somehow more dangerous. She wasn't going to let him push her around. "I'm not resisting. I'm just not doing anything wrong," she replied, a touch of defiance in her tone. Hayes stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "You're making a scene for no reason. You really want to keep this up?" Amelia's eyes narrowed. She could feel his aggression mounting, and it took everything in her not to let fear take over. "I'm not doing anything illegal," she repeated, her voice sharper now, "and I'm not afraid of you." There was a moment of silence as Hayes processed her words, his jaw tightening. She could see the anger bubbling beneath the surface, but she held her ground. He wasn't going to intimidate her. "You think you're above the law?" Hayes sneered. "I'm giving you one more chance to cooperate. If not, I'll have to take action." Amelia didn't back down. "I'm not doing anything wrong, so why don't you stop threatening me and do your job?" That seemed to snap something in him. Hayes's hand moved toward his belt, and for a split second, Amelia's heart skipped a beat. Was he reaching for his gun? She steadied her breathing, watching him carefully. He didn't pull it out, but his fingers twitched at his holster. The threat was clear. Without a word, Amelia pulled out her phone. She held it up, her finger hovering over the camera button. She wasn't going to let this moment slip by without evidence. "I'm recording this," she said calmly, her voice even. "If you're not doing anything wrong, then you won't mind me having a record of this." Hayes froze, his eyes flicking to the phone. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he barked, his voice rising. "Turn that off right now." "I have every right to record in public," Amelia replied, her hand steady, "especially when I feel threatened. You don't get to intimidate me just because you're in uniform." The officer's face reddened, his fists clenched at his sides. He took a step forward, his body language becoming even more hostile. "You're obstructing justice. If you don't stop that, I'll charge you." Amelia didn't move. "I'm not obstructing anything. I'm just protecting myself. You've made it clear you're willing to escalate this for no reason." For a moment, Hayes seemed to struggle internally, his anger fighting against the professional side of him that knew better than to push further. He glanced at the phone again, his hand still hovering near his holster. Amelia could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her, but she stayed calm. She knew how quickly things could turn, how easily a simple confrontation could spiral out of control. But for now, she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of backing down. "I'm not the one who's in the wrong here," Amelia said, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. "You are." The air between Amelia and Officer Hayes grew heavy with tension, as if a storm was about to break. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest, but her grip on the phone remained steady. She wasn't going to give in. She had every right to be here, walking home, and she sure as hell wasn't going to let Hayes bully her into submission. "Put the phone down," Hayes growled. "I'm not going to tell you again." Amelia's eyes didn't leave his face. He was angry, flustered even, and it was clear he wasn't used to being challenged like this. "I'm not doing anything illegal, officer," she said, the calmness of her voice belying the storm of frustration inside her. "And I don't have to stop recording." "Not when you're threatening me." Hayes's jaw clenched tighter, his teeth grinding as if he was trying to control the rage building up inside him. The streetlights cast long shadows over the scene, and Amelia could hear the distant hum of traffic, as though the world around them had been suspended, waiting for the next move. "Do you know who I am?" Hayes finally barked. "I'm a cop. You don't get to tell me how to do my job." Amelia didn't flinch, but the words stung. It wasn't the first time she had been treated like this, and she wasn't surprised by the arrogance in his tone, but she wouldn't let it go unchallenged. "I don't care who you are," she said, her voice unwavering. "You don't get to treat me like this because of the color of my skin." Hayes's face twitched, the accusation hitting home harder than he would admit. He stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly now. "You want to keep making this difficult, huh? Fine. Let's see how long you last when I have to." "Stop!" Amelia interrupted, her voice cutting through the growing hostility like a blade. "You're not in control here. You're harassing me for no reason, and I'm not going to just stand here and let you do it." His hand hovered closer to his belt again. Amelia's heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively took a step back, but she didn't stop recording. She wasn't about to let him escalate this. She had seen too many stories where things went from bad to worse for people like her. Then suddenly, Hayes' expression shifted, though not in the way Amelia expected. He seemed to consider her words for a moment, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. But the anger was still there, smoldering beneath the surface. "You think you're clever, huh?" Hayes spat, taking another step forward. "But you're just making this worse for yourself." Amelia raised an eyebrow. "I'm making it worse? I'm the one who's been stopped for doing nothing wrong. If anyone's making this worse, it's you." The officer's expression darkened. "I've had enough of this," he said, his voice rising. "You're not going anywhere until I say so." Amelia could feel the heat building in her chest. Her breath came faster, but she didn't lose focus. "I'm going home, officer. You can't stop me from walking down the street. You have no right to keep me here." "I'll make sure you're detained if I have to," Hayes threatened, the edges of his voice now full of menace. "I don't take kindly to people disobeying me." At this point, Amelia realized that this wasn't just about her rights anymore. This wasn't about a misunderstanding or a routine stop. Hayes had already made up his mind about who she was, what she was, and it wasn't going to change no matter how much she tried to reason with him. Her hand tightened around the phone. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she repeated, her voice unwavering despite the rising tension. "And you're not going to intimidate me into thinking I am." Hayes' patience seemed to be wearing thin. His fingers twitched at his holster again, and Amelia could feel the weight of the situation shift in a way that was unmistakable. He was seconds away from making a move, and she had to be ready for it. "I'm warning you, you don't know what you're messing with," Hayes said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'll get you for obstruction." Amelia's eyes flicked to his hand, watching it carefully. "You do that, officer," she said, her words slow but firm. "But it's not going to go the way you think. I'm not the one who's breaking the law here. You are." For a moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to pause, waiting for someone to make the next move. The flashing lights from the police car continued to paint everything in a surreal red and blue glow, and Amelia felt the weight of that pressure like never before. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she steadied them, keeping the phone recording. This was her only protection now. "Let me know if this works, or if you need further adjustments." The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Amelia's eyes remained locked on Officer Hayes, who stood a few feet away, his hand still hovering near his holster. The tension was almost unbearable, and Amelia could feel every second tick by, her heart pounding louder than the sirens in the distance. But she wasn't backing down. "Listen, Amelia," Hayes said after a long pause, his voice strained, though still dripping with arrogance. "You don't know who you're dealing with. I've got a job to do, and I'm not going to let some kid like you make it harder." Amelia clenched her fists at her sides. She was done with his threats, done with his condescension. If this was what it was going to take for him to understand, then so be it. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," she shot back. "You're a cop who thinks you can intimidate people just because you wear a badge. You're wrong, officer, and you're not going to bully me into submission." A flicker of something, maybe doubt, maybe frustration, passed across Hayes' face. But the shift was brief, quickly replaced by a colder, more calculated look. He wasn't going to back down now either. "You want to make this a public spectacle?" he sneered, taking a step forward. "Fine, but I promise you, you're going to regret this. You'll be sorry when the department hears about your attitude." "I don't care about your threats," Amelia replied, her voice unwavering. "If anything, I'm just waiting for you to make a mistake." For a moment, Hayes didn't say anything. His hand finally moved away from his holster, but the tension in the air hadn't dissipated. Instead, it seemed to intensify, like a wire stretched to its breaking point. And then, just when Amelia thought she might be able to make it out of this without things getting worse, the sound of another car pulling up sliced through the stillness. The tires skidded to a stop on the wet pavement, and the door opened with a sharp creak. Amelia didn't take her eyes off Hayes, but she could feel the presence of the newcomer before she even turned her head. A woman stepped out of the car, her uniform a stark contrast to Hayes' more scruffy appearance. She was tall, composed, and she didn't seem to be carrying the same edge of frustration that Hayes was exuding. Amelia could see the badge on her chest and the way she walked toward them with authority. She had an air of calm control that Hayes lacked. "Everything okay here?" the woman asked, her voice calm but direct. Hayes tensed, visibly annoyed by the interruption. I'm handling this, Sergeant. This young lady, he gestured sharply toward Amelia, is being uncooperative, and I'm just about done with it. Amelia noticed the way the woman, Sergeant Marshall, eyed her for a moment, taking in the scene with a cool, almost clinical demeanor. Then she looked back at Hayes, her brow furrowing just slightly. What exactly is the issue? She asked, her tone not at all what Amelia had expected. She was far more measured, less inclined to support Hayes without questioning him first. He's been harassing me, Amelia said, her voice steady but insistent. I was just walking home. I've done nothing wrong, but he's been threatening me, trying to intimidate me into giving up my rights, and he hasn't given me a reason for stopping me. Marshall took a moment to process what Amelia had said. Her eyes flicked between the two of them, and Amelia could see the gears turning in her mind. Hayes shifted uncomfortably, clearly not used to having his authority questioned by someone within his own department. After a beat, Marshall addressed Hayes, her voice firm but not unkind. Is that true, Officer Hayes? Did you give her a reason for the stop? Hayes stiffened, his pride clearly wounded. Well, she was acting suspiciously, and I had to. Suspiciously? Marshall interrupted, her eyebrows raised in disbelief. By walking down the street, is that all it takes now? The reality of the situation was starting to hit, and Hayes' expression soured even more. He didn't have a legitimate reason for stopping Amelia, and Marshall was starting to see through his defensiveness. Amelia could see the cracks forming in his facade. Hayes stammered, clearly caught off guard by Marshall's questioning. But before he could finish, she raised a hand to silence him. Amelia, Marshall said, her voice softening slightly, I need you to stay calm, okay? I'm going to make sure this is resolved. I'm going to need your statement, but I want to make sure you're okay. Amelia nodded, though she was still processing the fact that someone was finally listening to her. The whole ordeal had left her shaken, but there was a sense of relief in knowing that someone was on her side. Hayes, on the other hand, seemed to shrink under Marshall's scrutiny, the arrogance draining from his posture as he realized he wasn't getting away with this. Well, I'm going to have to report this, Hayes muttered, clearly frustrated. But you're making a mistake, Marshall. This is going to come back on you. I don't think it will, Marshall replied calmly, her gaze never leaving him. Let's make sure we get the facts straight first, officer. Amelia stood taller, her body still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. But the feeling of victory, however small, was settling in. She had stood her ground, and for the first time tonight, she didn't feel so alone. The tension in the air finally began to dissipate as Sergeant Marshall took control of the situation. Hayes, now visibly deflated, stepped back as Marshall addressed Amelia once more. Amelia, she said, her tone even but reassuring. I'm sorry you had to go through this. It shouldn't have happened. I'll make sure this gets looked into. Amelia nodded, her emotions still raw from the confrontation, but there was a glimmer of hope now. She hadn't been completely powerless. She had stood up for herself, and for the first time, someone had listened, really listened. Thank you, she said, her voice quieter now but grateful. I was just walking home, She hesitated, shaking her head. I didn't do anything wrong. I know, Marshall replied, her eyes softening as she glanced at the young woman. That's why I'm here now. Officer Hayes will have to explain his actions. I'll make sure of that. Amelia couldn't help but feel a sense of justice, fragile as it might be, blooming inside her. For so long, she had felt like a small, insignificant piece in a system that didn't care about her. But tonight, things had shifted. Maybe it was small, but it was a start. She glanced at Hayes, who was now standing a little further off, his arms crossed in frustration, clearly stewing over the situation. He shot a quick, venomous look at Amelia before turning his attention back to his phone, clearly calculating his next move. But the fight had already been taken out of him. Amelia, I need you to stick around for a bit while I fill out the paperwork, Marshall said, bringing her back to the present. It'll be a short statement. I know this isn't easy, but it's necessary. Amelia took a deep breath, nodding. I understand. The paperwork was quick, though the gravity of the situation weighed on her. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how much could have gone wrong tonight. How many others might have been too afraid or too intimidated to speak up. Once the forms were completed and Marshall had made sure everything was in order, she gave Amelia a reassuring smile. "I'll handle it from here," she said. "We'll be in touch, okay? If you need anything or have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out." Amelia felt a weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't fighting alone. As Amelia walked away from the scene, the cool night air hit her face, and the city seemed quieter somehow, more at peace. Her feet carried her down the street, back toward the apartment where she lived, but her thoughts were already racing ahead, processing everything that had happened. What now? The legal process would take time. Hayes's actions would be scrutinized, and Amelia knew that no matter the outcome, there would be more battles ahead, more struggles for people like her who felt like they didn't belong, who felt like their voices were too small to be heard. But tonight had been a turning point, and somehow in the midst of all the chaos, Amelia realized that she wasn't as powerless as she had once believed. Her steps were lighter as she made her way home, the weight of uncertainty still lingering, but tempered by a new sense of determination. The world wasn't going to change overnight, but change had to start somewhere, and for Amelia, it had started with her.